Hi there and welcome back to Deep Dive. This is a podcast of Murrelbark Baptist Church that goes beyond the surface to explore life and faith together. My name is John. I have the privilege of being the lead pastor here at MBC, and we're going to be diving into one of the more foundational truths of our Christian faith today, and that is that God speaks. We worship a God that speaks, but more on that as we get going. I want to explore how God, who has spoken throughout history, now speaks to us through his Son, Jesus Christ. And there's truth in this, there's power in this that can transform us as we walk with him. In this episode, we will focus on those first 4 verses of Hebrews. Once again, the author makes this declaration that God is a God who speaks, who spoke in different ways in the past and now has spoken to us through his Son that we know is Jesus. And we'll unpack what that means today. I hope you've had a good week, and it is great that you can join me once again here on Deep Dive. But let's start with the idea that God has always been a God who speaks. Hebrews 1 reminds us that in the past, God spoke to our ancestors through the prophets at many times and in various ways. Have a think about that for a moment. Since the very beginning, since creation, God has been communicating with his people. In the creation accounts themselves, we read of Adam and Eve being communicated to by God in the garden, through the patriarchs and through the ancestors of old from the Old Testament. We see that God speaks through them to Abraham, to Moses and the like. And then through the prophets, he brings his word to the people, or through those prophets to his people. And what about to us today? Well, over time, it seems that God's ways of communicating has evolved. And so this first verse reminds us that God now speaks through his ultimate revelation, his Son, Jesus. In the sermon I preached a few weeks ago on this, I gave the illustration of how we used to store data. When I first had a computer, the data would be stored on these big 5-inch floppy disks that would be inserted into the computer and would be read very slowly and not much data stored on them. Then that went down to about 3-inch floppy disks, which were a little bit harder and a little bit more data able to store on them. Then it came to CDs, then USB drives, and also obviously with that mysterious cloud that we all load things up to now. And so the way we store data has changed. It was like this. It was a floppy disk, but now it is changed to the cloud. God, in his providence, is continuing to speak, but now, as the writer of Hebrews reminds us, he speaks through his Son Jesus. He says in verse 2, "But in these last days he has spoken to us by his Son, whom he appointed heir of all things, and through whom also he made the universe." God's way of communicating is speaking through his prophets, Moses, Elijah, Isaiah, Jeremiah, whoever it may be, and bringing his word to his people in that particular context. Now in these last days, which is the days we are in since the death and resurrection of Jesus, he has continued to speak through his Son, Jesus. Jesus isn't just another messenger or another prophet, but this is God's final word to humanity, this Son of God, this Jesus Christ. So what does that mean? Well, it means that in Jesus we see this full revelation of God, of who he is and what he wants to communicate to us. He isn't just relaying a message from God. Jesus is actually the message. When we look at Jesus, we see God's heart, God's character, God's intentions for us, and for his kingdom. Well, how do we then respond to the fact that God has spoken through his Son? Perhaps it starts by being intentional about listening to God's voice in our daily lives. The Bible, his scriptures, are the primary way God speaks to us today. So, well, it would make sense, wouldn't it, to take the time to read it, to meditate on it, to let it shape our thoughts and actions, our attitudes. And more recently, I've been struck by this idea of listening to the voice of God. I've been reading and rereading the Psalms, 3 or 4 a day. This year has all been for me a bit of a read-a-thon of the Psalms. And often the psalmist will write about listening to God's voice. In fact, in chapter 3, the writer of Hebrews warns those who are not listening to his voice and who have hard hearts, but we'll get to that at another stage. But that is also a refrain in the Psalms, to listen to God's voice. Because as we know, there are times when we don't listen to God's voice. Instead, we listen to ourselves. We are the ones, of course, who speak most to ourselves. It's not our friends or family or a person we might be texting on the phone. In fact, who do we listen to the most? Most likely ourselves. But God obviously has a place to and is one to be listened to. And so listening to his voice is something that we need to begin doing. And we can do that starting by reading his scriptures and reading how he has spoken through his Son Jesus. Whether we're facing a challenge or a particular decision right now and we're not sure what to do, well, we don't have to just rely on our own wisdom, but we take a moment, we pray, we ask God to speak through his word. And in fact, we also have friends and fellow believers around us who can also add God's wisdom to us. We expect when we read the Bible that God will guide us through his Son. Sometimes, obviously, it's not the exact thing we want him, or perhaps we thought of. It's not the exact way in which we thought God might help us. But in the end, God is guiding us, and he's guiding us through his Son, and he's guiding us through his Son, which we read about in his word. And so perhaps the first step is to listen to God's voice through his word. And the second step then is to respond. When God speaks, he often calls us into action, doesn't he? It could be as simple as reaching out to someone in need, making that significant change in our lives. Whatever it is, we trust that God's voice through Jesus is leading us in the right direction. I encourage you to do something tangible today when you hear from God. Maybe it's the challenge to take a step of faith in some sort of friendship or relationship, or set aside time to seek God's guidance in a particular area in your life. Whatever it might be, let's be a people who not only hear God's voice, but also act on it. Well, as we close out today's episode, I'd love for you to remember that God, who has spoken in many ways throughout history, has now spoken to us through his Son. And Jesus is the ultimate revelation of God and his heart and his will for us. So let's be intentional this week about seeking his voice and responding in faith. If you've enjoyed this episode, please consider subscribing, rating, reviewing Deep Dive. Wherever you're listening, your support really helps us. And I'd love to have people reach out to me and reach out across this podcast. Next week, we'll continue our journey through Hebrews, diving deeper into its message. Until then, I pray that you keep your ears open to God's voice and keep diving deep with us. Thanks very much. Ta.